Imagine sitting down at your desk on, like, a perfectly normal Tuesday.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. And you take out a pen, grab a piece of paper, and you write a completely coherent, beautifully structured sentence.
Like a note to your spouse or just a quick reminder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A grocery list, whatever. You put the pen down, step away for a cup of coffee, and when you come back just moments later, you look down at the paper and you are entirely unable to read the very words you just wrote.
Oh, wow.
You aren't just struggling to read it either. You are staring at your own handwriting as if it were an ancient, undecipherable alien script.
I mean, it genuinely sounds like the plot of a science fiction movie.
Yeah.
Like a sudden, terrifying glitch in reality where your own brain just, well, locks you out of your own thoughts.
That is exactly how it feels. But it isn't science fiction at all. It's a very real, incredibly specific mechanical glitch in the human brain.
It really is.
So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to map out the bizarre and absolutely fascinating geography of the human brain.
Which is a huge task. But we're doing it by looking at what happens when the blood supply to this intricate supercomputer gets cut off in highly specific places.
Right. We're dealing with clinical medical material today from the scripts over at the audio ward. Specifically, we're getting into the neurology of PCA, thalamic, and watershed stroke syndromes.
And look, that is traditionally dense, highly specialized material. We're talking about the intricate vascular maps that neurologists and medical students spend like years trying to memorize.
Because literally a millimeter of difference in where a blood vessel is blocked can completely change a patient's reality.
Exactly.
And for you listening right now, that might sound like we're about to sit here and read a heavy medical textbook, but I promise you this is actually a treasure map.
A very weird biological treasure map.
Yeah. By looking at how the brain breaks down, we get this fascinating behind-the-scenes look at how your perception, your memory, and your moment-to-moment physical reality are actually constructed. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good.
We need to start our journey at the very back of the brain.
Right, so we are entering the posterior circulation. Specifically, the territory fed by the posterior cerebral artery, which neurologists just call the PCA.
PCA.
Yeah, and this is the primary plumbing system that feeds your visual processing centers. Like when you open your eyes, the light hits your retina, sure, but the actual seeing part.
Yeah.
That happens back here thanks to the blood pump through the PCA.
And the symptoms of a stroke here depend entirely on exactly where the blockage, the occlusion, sits along that artery.
Precisely.
So let's say you get a blockage in one of the unilateral hemispheric branches. The clinical term for the fallout is contralateral homonymous hemianopia.
Which is a massive mouthful.
It really is. But breaking that down, it basically means you lose exactly half of your field of vision on the opposite side of where the stroke occurred, right?
Yep. So if the left side of the brain is starved of blood, the right half of your visual world just completely ceases to exist.
But there is a really fascinating caveat to that kind of vision loss, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes patients experience what is called macular sparing.
Macular sparing? What is the macula again?
So the macula is the very center of your visual field. It's the high-resolution part you use to read a book or recognize a face.
Okay, got it.
So with macular sparing, a patient could lose the entire left half of their visual world, but they still retain this tiny, perfectly clear window of central vision right in the middle of the darkness.
But how is that even physically possible? I mean, if the blood supply to the visual cortex is cut, shouldn't the whole thing just go dark?
You would definitely think so. But the very tip of the visual cortex, the occipital pole, which processes that central vision, sometimes has a backup generator.
So backup generator.
Yeah, it sits right on the border of another major artery's territory. So even if the PCA gets completely blocked, that tiny, crucial patch of tissue might still steal enough collateral blood flow from the neighboring vascular system to stay alive.
Oh, wow. So it's a literal anatomical failsafe to protect your central vision.
Exactly.
That specificity is wild. And it gets so much stranger when we move beyond just raw visual fields because, seeing isn't just about light hitting a lens.
Right. It's about interpretation.
Yeah. We also see complex visual disturbances when different branches of the PCA are blocked, things like visual and color agnosias.
Where a person can clearly see an object or see a color, but their brain can no longer categorize or identify what it actually is.
Right. And then there is prosopagnosia.
Face blindness, which is it's a profound deficit.
With prosopagnosia, you could look directly at your own spouse or your child and just see a collection of features, right? Like eyes, nose, mouth. But there is zero identity attached to it.
Yeah, the facial recognition software is just gone. uninstalled.
Which proves that human vision is this highly segregated construction project.
Absolutely. The PCA feeds different, highly specialized departments of that project. One department handles color processing, another handles facial geometry.
So when a tiny blood clot stops the flow to the face recognition department, the camera itself is perfectly fine.
The visual cortex is registering the image, yeah.
But the downstream software that categorizes and attaches emotional meaning to that face has just lost power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings us perfectly back to your opening scenario. The person who writes a sentence but can't read it.
Right, the glitch. Neurologists call this a disconnection syndrome, don't they?
They do. It happens when there is an infarction, basically tissue death, from lack of blood in the callosal branches of the artery.
So it specifically hits the left occipital region and a structure called the splenium of the corpus callosum.
Yes, and this specific combination produces alexia without agraphia.
Let's break those terms down. Alexia is the inability to read,
Right.
and agraphia is the inability to write. So alexia without agraphia means the patient can write perfectly well, but they cannot read at all.
Correct. They can speak fluently, they can spell words out loud without any hesitation, but looking at written text yields absolutely nothing.
It feels completely counterintuitive. It's like typing code to build a website, but the moment you hit publish, your own brain no longer understands the programming language you just used.
That's a great analogy.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this. How does a paradoxical disconnection like that actually happen in the wiring?
Well, you have to picture the brain as a massive network of fiber optic cables. The left side of the brain, in most people, is the dominant side for language output and motor control for writing.
Okay.
In this specific stroke, that language center is completely untouched. The motor cortex that sends signals to your hand to hold the pen and form letters is also perfectly fine. The output pathways have full power.
Okay, that makes sense. The machinery to generate and physically write the words is fully online.
But reading requires a different pathway entirely. To read, visual information has to be collected and then physically routed to that language center on the left side to be decoded.
Right.
Now remember, the stroke hit the left occipital region, so the left visual cortex is dead. It's blind.
But the right visual cortex is still working, right? It can still see the words on the page.
It sees them perfectly. But here's where the devastating disconnection happens. To get that visual data from the right side of the brain over to the language center on the left side, the signal has to cross a bridge.
And that bridge is the corpus callosum.
Yes. And the specific back part of that bridge, the splenium, was destroyed by the exact same stroke that took out the left visual cortex.
Oh, wow. So the right side of the brain is staring at the letters, gathering all this visual data, but the bridge is out. It literally cannot hand the image over to the left side and say, hey, what does this say?
Exactly. The visual input is entirely isolated from the language comprehension center. The text is visually crisp and clear, but because the signal can't cross the chasm, the words are stripped of all linguistic meaning. You're basically just left staring at shapes.
That is just mind-bending. It really highlights how fragile our reality is. But our map goes deeper than just the surface-level cortex, doesn't it?
Oh, much deeper.
Because the blood vessels we are tracking penetrate deep into the center of the brain, into the midbrain and the thalamus. And when strokes happen in these deep territories, they don't just erase our senses, they can actively twist them.
The thalamus is arguably one of the most critical structures we possess. It is the brain's grand central relay station.
So everything goes through there.
Almost everything. Every sensory signal, touch, pain, temperature, vision, and many motor signals must pass through the thalamus to be routed to the correct part of the cortex.
So if the tiny penetrating branches of the PCA get blocked down here, the fallout is massive.
Yeah. Depending on the exact spot, a patient might suffer aphasia, losing their language, or akinetic mutism, where they are awake but absolutely cannot move or speak, or even global amnesia.
And the thalamus isn't just some messy junction box. It is incredibly organized into 4 major vascular territories. Let's trace this plumbing geographically.
Okay, let's do it.
If we look at the anterior, or front territory, fed by the polar artery, a stroke here seems to heavily impact behavior and awareness.
Yes. The anterior portion routes a lot of emotional and cognitive data. A stroke here produces neuropsychological disturbances.
Like what?
Well, you'll see emotional facial paresis, meaning the patient's face might droop only when they try to smile or express emotion, but they can move it voluntarily otherwise.
That is so specific.
And the symptoms are highly lateralized. If the left side is hit, The patient struggles with language, which is known as dysphagia. If the right side takes the hit, it causes profound neglect, where the brain essentially deletes the left side of the universe from its awareness.
Unbelievable. Then, if we move to the top and back, the dorsal territory, we hit vision again.
Right.
A stroke here causes homonymous quadrantinopia, which is losing exactly a quarter of your visual field, or horizontal sector nopias. I assume that's because the visual cables from the eyes are routing specifically through this dorsal quadrant of the relay station before hitting the back of the brain.
You've got it. The thalamus organizes the cables perfectly.
Moving to the middle, we have the paramedian territory. And a stroke here triggers a very famous classic triad of clinical symptoms, right?
It does. Decreased consciousness, severe memory loss, and vertical gaze abnormalities.
So basically, the patient is lethargic, amnesic, and physically cannot move their eyes up and down.
Yeah. Whenever a clinician sees that specific triad, consciousness, memory, and eye movement failing together, it is a massive, glaring red flag pointing directly to the paramedian thalamus.
But the fourth territory is the one that really stops me in my tracks. The posterolateral region, which sits at the back and side of the thalamus.
This one is intense.
Because a stroke here can cause pure sensory loss, or it can trigger something called Dejerine-Roussy syndrome.
Right.
This causes sensory loss across the opposite side of the body, but it's accompanied by severe dysesthesias, which neurologists call thalamic pain, and choreoauthotoid or ballistic movements, which basically means wild, involuntary flailing of the limbs.
Dejerine-Roussy is a profound and often torturous disruption of the human experience.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. We usually think of a stroke as a deficit, a lack of something, you know?
Sure, yeah.
You lose your vision, you lose your ability to speak, you lose feeling in your arm. So how does a stroke in this posterolateral territory cause agonizing pain and wild ballistic movements? Where is this sudden excess of chaotic energy coming from if the tissue is literally dead?
What's fascinating here is that it forces us to rethink what the thalamus actually does. It is not just a passive relay station that passes signals along.
Okay.
It is an active filter. It modulates and dampens signals. When you damage that specific posterolateral territory, you aren't just cutting the sensory wires, you are destroying the brain's ability to inhibit and filter information.
So it's not just a broken wire, it's a broken regulator. Like a microphone suddenly feeding back on itself because the sound mixer is broken.
That is a phenomenal way to picture it. The initial sensory loss happens because normal touch signals can't get through the damaged relay. But then, the damaged, dying tissue starts misfiring. Without the inhibitory filters in place, it starts sending phantom, agonizing pain signals up to the cortex. That is thalamic pain.
Oh my God.
The lightest touch, like a bedsheet resting on a leg, might be perceived by the cortex as burning fire or crushing pressure.
And the ballistic movements, is that the exact same mechanism?
Essentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The thalamus helps smooth out and apply the brakes to our motor commands. Without that specific inhibition center working, the motor system basically runs away with itself.
So the sudden, involuntary flailing movements are a result of the brain losing its brakes rather than losing its engine.
Precisely.
That paints such a vivid, terrifying picture of how delicate our internal wiring truly is. We're so reliant on these inhibitory filters just to sit still and feel comfortable.
We really take them for granted.
But let's shift gears, because there is a major architectural twist to this plumbing. We've established that the thalamus has very clean, predictable vascular zones on both sides of the brain, right?
Yep.
The left has its blood supply, the right has its blood supply. But occasionally, someone is born with a totally different set of blueprints.
This brings us to one of the most notorious anatomical variants in neurology, the artery of Percheron.
The artery of Percheron.
It is a variant that is genuinely worth knowing by name because it completely subverts the usual rules of brain plumbing.
It sounds like an artifact in a fantasy novel. What exactly is the anomaly here?
So normally the paramedian area of the thalamus, that middle section that controls consciousness and memory, gets a separate, dedicated perforating artery for the left side and one for the right side.
Two separate pipes.
Exactly. But in a certain percentage of people during fetal development, the main branch that usually feeds one side just doesn't form.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So to compensate, they develop a single shared perforating artery that sprouts up and supplies both sides of the paramedian thalamus bilaterally. Two critical territories fed by one single pipe.
On paper, that just sounds like biological efficiency. Why is it a problem?
Well, it's perfectly fine right up until a blood clot travels up the system. Because if a clot manages to wedge itself into that single artery of Percheron, the patient suffers a bilateral thalamic infarction.
Both sides at once.
Yeah, both sides of the relay station lose their blood supply at the exact same moment from one tiny blockage.
Oh, I see where this is going. So you get that paramedian triad we talked about, the decreased consciousness, the memory loss, the inability to look up and down, but it hits both sides of the brain simultaneously.
And that is incredibly dangerous in a clinical setting.
Why is that?
Because when an emergency room doctor sees a bilateral deficit symptoms hitting both sides of the brain or body at once, their training tells them this is a global issue.
Ah.
They assume the patient's heart stopped pumping effectively, or there was a massive drop in oxygen, or the brain is swelling globally.
Because normal clots, like embolic strokes, usually just go down one pipe, affecting one specific side.
Precisely. Embolic strokes are almost always unilateral. So the artery of Percheron is a master mimic. It mimics a massive global disaster, which completely confuses the clinical picture.
When in reality, it is just one tiny, localized clot in a very uniquely placed pipe.
Exactly. If a neurologist doesn't specifically know to look for this rare variant on an MRI, they could entirely misdiagnose the underlying physics of the stroke.
Which transitions us perfectly into the final major piece of our map today. We just talked about how the artery of Percheron mimics a global issue.
Right.
But what happens when there actually is a systemic global issue?
Right, when the overall water pressure to the entire brain drops. Neurologists refer to these as watershed or border zone infarcts.
This represents a fundamental shift in the mechanism of injury, doesn't it?
It does. Everything we've discussed so far, the face blindness, the isolated reading loss, the thalamic pain, these are all caused by a localized clot blocking a specific pipe. But watershed strokes are entirely different. They are caused by sustained hypotension.
Meaning low blood pressure. The heart, the main pump, just isn't pushing hard enough to get blood everywhere it needs to go.
Yes. Think of a patient undergoing complex cardiac surgery or someone who suffers cardiac arrest or has prolonged low oxygen or severe blockages in both carotid arteries. The pressure drops system-wide.
And when that overall pressure drops, the areas of the brain that suffer first are the territories right on the borders between adjacent arterial supplies, the absolute ends of the line.
Right.
It makes me think of a sprinkler system on a massive golf course.
Oh, I like that.
Like, if the major arteries are the sprinkler heads, the watershed areas are those patches of grass right in the exact middle, furthest away from any two sprinklers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When the city water pressure drops, the grass right next to the sprinklers might survive, but those middle patches on the borders are the very first to dry out and die.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
Yeah.
And depending on which border zone on the golf course dries out, you get wildly different, highly specific symptoms.
For instance,
Well, let's look at the border between the three major arteries. The anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries.
the ACA, MCA, and PCA.
Right. If the pressure drops enough to damage the border where all three meet, you get bilateral parieto-occipital infarcts. This produces lower visual field defects, optic ataxia, and cortical blindness.
But if the damage is just isolated to the border between the MCA and the PCA, you might get cortical blindness that eventually improves, but it leaves behind this incredibly bizarre footprint.
Yeah, it leaves behind dyslexia, dyscalculia, which is an inability to do math, and memory deficits.
It's as if the pressure drop just wiped out the highly specialized high-level software running at the very outer edge of the network.
Exactly. And then there is perhaps the most visually striking and famous watershed pattern. The border zone located between the ACA and the MCA, bilaterally near the top of the brain.
Yes, the pattern of the day in clinical circles. When this border zone dries out, it produces bibrachial cortical sensory-motor impairment.
Again, a lot of clinical syllables.
A ton of syllables. But the shorthand neurologists use is the person in a barrel syndrome. So what does this all mean? I want you to literally picture yourself standing inside a heavy wooden barrel.
Okay, picturing it.
The barrel comes right up to your shoulders.
Yeah.
Your arms are trapped completely inside, heavy, paralyzed, entirely unable to move. But your legs, sticking out the bottom of the barrel, they can walk, kick, and move perfectly fine.
It is such a profound presentation. The motor cortex that controls the arms happens to sit right in that vulnerable watershed border zone, while the area controlling the legs sits closer to the main blood supply.
So the arms are disproportionately paralyzed while the legs are spared.
Yeah. Seeing that person in a barrel presentation is an immediate glaring alarm bell for clinicians that the patient suffered a bilateral ACA-MCA watershed injury.
And crucially, it proves that the issue wasn't a localized clot. It proves there was a massive drop in system pressure, which actually ties back to a specific case file that clinicians Anya and Rohan were reviewing in the material. They were looking at a patient who had a brief drop in oxygen and blood pressure during hospital transport.
A classic setup for a watershed injury.
Right. But when they evaluated the patient, they found something that completely shifted their diagnostic approach.
Yeah, despite that known blood pressure dip, the patient's physical deficit remained strictly unilateral.
Meaning the paralysis was only on one side, localized perfectly within the middle cerebral artery territory.
Wait, so because it didn't look like the person in a barrel, because the symptoms didn't hit both sides at the borders, it meant they weren't dealing with a global pressure failure after all.
Precisely. Anya noted that the unilateral presentation was actually reassuring.
Reassuring because it means the pump didn't fail.
Yes. The brief pressure dip didn't cause a watershed stroke. The problem was just a localized clot, a focal event. They suddenly knew exactly what kind of physical enemy they were fighting.
And that is the beauty of this vascular map. The clinical presentation, the anatomy of the deficit, dictates the reality of the underlying physics.
It's like reverse engineering. By meticulously reading the symptoms, a good clinician can figure out whether they are dealing with a blocked pipe or a failing pump.
It is truly incredible.
We have covered a mass amount of intricate territory today. We mapped out the back of the brain, discovering how a tiny stroke can leave you perfectly capable of writing a letter you can never read.
Which is still wild to me.
We went deep into the center of the thalamus, learning how a damaged filter doesn't just numb you, but can unleash agonizing pain and chaotic movement.
Dejarin Rusi.
Right. We explored the architectural quirk of the artery of Percheron, where a single anomalous pipe can take down both sides of the system. And finally, we looked at the edges of the map, the watershed zones, where a simple drop in water pressure leaves a patient trapped inside an invisible barrel.
It is a testament to how hyper-specialized and localized the human machine truly is.
I want to leave you, the listener, with something to chew on as you go about your day. Based on all these tiny, hidden vascular mechanics we just pulled apart, what is the big takeaway here?
If we connect all this to the bigger picture, it really forces you to look at your own biology and your own humanity a little differently.
How so?
Well, we learned today that slight invisible variations in our vascular plumbing, like simply being born with an artery of Percheron, can completely change how brain damage manifests and how our bodies ultimately fail.
Right.
It raises a fascinating, almost philosophical question. If the literal layout of your blood vessels dictates so much of your pathology, how much of your everyday conscious experience, your personality quirks, your specific talents, and your memory are subtly shaped by the totally unique, individualized roadmap of the blood vessels inside your head?
Oh, wow.
Like how much of the core of you is just a byproduct of how your internal plumbing happened to be laid out before you were even born?
A completely terrifying yet deeply awe-inspiring thought. You are quite literally the sum of your parts, right down to the microscopic perforating arteries keeping the lights on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The medical world is wildly complex, and the diagnostic waters can be incredibly murky, but as we saw today, there is always a way to map it, to understand it, and to read the signs.
Even if you forget how to read your own handwriting.
Exactly. Until next time.